The structure still stands, but not in the way it once did. At Lyndhurst Mansion, the surface suggests continuity, stone intact, towers undisturbed, grounds composed as if nothing essential had ever been interrupted. Yet the illusion depends on distance. Up close, what remains is not the uninterrupted life of an estate, but the careful preservation of something that nearly failed to survive its own moment of greatest vulnerability. There was a point when this place was not secure, not symbolically, but structurally, financially, operationally, existentially. The systems that sustained it, capital, confidence, continuity, contracted abruptly. The estate, designed to project permanence, was forced to absorb instability it was never meant to reveal. The Panic of 1893 did not damage the mansion in visible ways. It did something quieter and more consequential. It exposed the dependency beneath the grandeur, the extent to which even the most controlled environments rely on forces beyond their walls. What appeared self-contained was, in fact, contingent. That Lyndhurst endured is often treated as evidence of strength, but endurance, in this case, is not a simple story of resilience. It is a record of adjustment, of what was preserved, what was altered, and what was quietly surrendered in order to continue existing at all. Chapter 1. The Surface of Survival. At Lyndhurst Mansion, the present is arranged with care. Paths are maintained to a precise width, neither overgrown nor excessively restored. Lawns hold their edges. The stone facade carries no visible strain. What appears at first encounter is coherence, a structure and landscape that have resisted interruption. The estate does not present itself as recovered or repaired. It presents itself as continuous. This condition is not accidental. It is administered. Every surface has been calibrated to communicate stability. Materials are preserved not simply for their age, but for their capacity to sustain an impression of uninterrupted function. Wood is treated to retain its tone without appearing renewed. Glass is kept clear, but not replaced beyond recognition. The aim is not restoration to a singular moment in time, but the maintenance of a believable continuity across many. Visitors move through an environment that has been disciplined into consistency. Interior spaces are arranged to suggest occupancy without presence. Objects remain in position, but their function has shifted. Rooms that once operated as parts of a living system now operate as evidence of one. Circulation is controlled. Access is guided. The estate reveals itself in measured increments, never all at once. What is encountered, then, is not the estate as it functioned, but the estate as it is now interpreted. This distinction is managed quietly. There are no abrupt signals that a transition has taken place. Instead, the shift is embedded in the way the environment behaves. Silence is more complete than it would have been. Movement is more regulated. The unpredictability of daily life, once absorbed and structured by the estate, is absent. In its place is a form of order that does not originate from within. The systems that sustain Lyndhurst in the present are external to its original design. Maintenance schedules, preservation standards, and interpretive frameworks now determine how the estate operates. These systems are precise, but they serve a different objective. Where the original estate coordinated labor, wealth, and social activity, the present estate coordinates perception. Nothing is left to operate independently. Climate is controlled to protect materials. Light is moderated to prevent deterioration. Even absence is managed. Emptiness is curated so that it reads as intentional rather than neglected. The result is a structure that appears stable, but whose stability is conditional. It depends on continuous oversight. It depends on funding structures that exist outside the estate itself. It depends on a set of professional practices designed not to extend the estate's original function, but to prevent further change. This produces a specific kind of stillness. It is not the stillness of inactivity, but of containment. The estate is held in place, its variables reduced, its unpredictability removed. What remains is a controlled environment in which time is allowed to pass only in limited, carefully managed ways. Within this framework, continuity becomes a performance. The estate must appear as though it has endured without interruption, even as the mechanisms that once sustained it have been replaced entirely. The challenge is not structural preservation alone, but the preservation of meaning, ensuring that the building continues to signify what it once did, despite no longer functioning in the same way. This requires a form of discipline that extends beyond maintenance. It involves decisions about what to retain, what to remove, and what to reinterpret. It involves determining which aspects of the estate's past are legible in the present, and which must be softened or obscured. The process is ongoing, and it is rarely visible. What the visitor encounters is the outcome, not the process. From a distance, Lyndhurst appears unchanged. Up close, the consistency holds. But this consistency is not the product of uninterrupted use. It is the result of sustained intervention, applied with enough restraint that it does not announce itself. The estate, in its current state, is neither fully original nor newly constructed. It occupies a controlled middle condition, where change has occurred but is not allowed to appear as such. Chapter 2. Cultural Weight and Social Function. At Lyndhurst Mansion, significance was never confined to structure. The estate did not derive its importance from design alone, nor from scale, nor from aesthetic distinction. Its authority emerged from use, from the patterns of behavior it sustained and the relationships it quietly ordered. What occurred within its boundaries was neither incidental nor ornamental. It was structured, repeated, and understood by those who moved through it. Lyndhurst functioned as a contained environment in which hierarchy could be both expressed and stabilized. Entry was not merely physical, it was conditional. Access to the estate implied recognition, and recognition carried implications beyond the immediate encounter. To be received within its rooms was to be positioned within a network that extended outward into finance, governance, and industry. The estate did not need to declare this, it operated through assumption. Its spaces were arranged to support this function. Rooms were not neutral, they directed movement, proximity, and duration. Encounters were shaped by architecture: who could approach, who would wait, who would remain. The sequencing of interiors created a subtle gradation of access, reinforcing distinctions without explicit instruction. Within this system, visibility was managed carefully. Not all presence was meant to be seen. Certain interactions occurred within controlled sightlines, while others were positioned beyond them. The estate enabled both exposure and concealment, depending on what was required. This dual capacity allowed it to function as both a stage and a filter. The individuals who entered Lyndhurst did so with an understanding, often unspoken, of how to behave within it. Conduct was not enforced through overt rules, but through repetition and expectation. Patterns of speech, timing, and deference were maintained with precision.
Deviations were not corrected openly, they were absorbed and remembered. Over time, this produced consistency. The estate became a place where outcomes could be anticipated. Conversations followed established rhythms. Introductions carried predictable consequences. Agreements, when formed within this environment, drew legitimacy from the setting itself. Lyndhurst did not create authority, but it concentrated and confirmed it. This concentration depended on continuity. The same individuals or their equivalents returned repeatedly. The estate hosted not isolated events, but ongoing processes. Relationships were extended across visits, decisions revisited, positions reinforced. Lyndhurst provided a stable setting in which time could accumulate without disruption. Its role, then, was not to initiate, but to sustain. Financial arrangements, social alignments, and reputational judgments all passed through its spaces, not as singular moments, but as part of a larger pattern. The estate offered a degree of insulation from external volatility. Within its boundaries, interactions could proceed according to internal logic rather than immediate external pressures. This insulation was partial but effective. It allowed participants to operate with a degree of predictability that was not always available elsewhere. In doing so, Lyndhurst contributed to the maintenance of a broader system, one in which authority was reinforced through repetition and proximity rather than declaration. The estate also functioned as a point of observation. Information moved through it in controlled ways. What was said, what was withheld, and what was implied all carried weight. Presence alone could signal alignment or distance. Absence equally could be interpreted. Lyndhurst did not need to record these signals formally. It retained them through memory and association. This capacity made it more than a residence. It became a site where position could be assessed without direct confrontation. The arrangement of a dinner, the composition of a guest list, the duration of a visit, each element contributed to a larger understanding of status and intent. The estate translated these details into meaning without requiring explicit articulation. Such translation depended on discipline. Staff, though largely unseen, maintained the conditions under which this system could operate. Timing, order, and discretion were essential. Interruptions were minimized. Transitions between spaces were managed so that interactions appeared seamless. The estate's function relied on this precision, even as it remained largely invisible to those it served. In this way, Lyndhurst supported a form of power that did not need to announce itself. It operated through alignment of space, behavior, and expectation. What it enabled was not spectacle, but continuity. Its influence extended outward, carried by those who passed through it, reinforced by the consistency of what they encountered within.
Chapter 4. The Internal System. At Lyndhurst Mansion, continuity was not an abstract quality. It was produced daily through a system that operated with precision and without interruption. The estate did not depend on singular acts of oversight. It relied on repetition, structured, disciplined, and largely unseen. Each day followed a sequence that had been established not for convenience but for stability. The objective was not efficiency in the modern sense, but consistency. Variation was minimized, predictability was maintained. This required a defined hierarchy. Staffing at Lyndhurst was organized according to function and proximity. Roles were distributed in a way that ensured both specialization and control. Those responsible for the interior operated under different expectations than those managing the grounds.
Movement between these domains was limited, not only to preserve order, but to maintain clarity of responsibility. Within the house, labor was further divided. Tasks were assigned with specificity: cleaning, preparation, service, maintenance, each carried out by individuals trained to perform them in a particular manner. The objective was not merely completion, but uniformity. Surfaces were maintained to a consistent standard. Objects were returned to fixed positions. The environment was kept in a state that appeared self-sustaining. Timing governed this process. Work occurred in cycles that aligned with the rhythms of the estate. Early hours were reserved for preparation, ensuring that the visible spaces were in order before they were occupied. Activity receded as the day progressed, allowing the estate to function without visible disruption. By evening, the system adjusted again, supporting the requirements of reception and presence. These transitions were managed without interruption. Movement through the house followed designated paths. Service corridors and secondary staircases allowed staff to operate without entering the primary spaces unless required. The estate was designed to absorb labor without displaying it. What appeared effortless was in fact structured concealment. Beyond the interior, the grounds followed a parallel logic. Maintenance of the landscape required coordination across seasons. Lawns were cut according to schedule, not condition. Trees were managed to preserve their form, not their natural growth. Paths were kept clear, not only for use, but for appearance. The exterior environment reinforced the same principle as the interior: continuity through control. Financial flows sustained this system. Expenditures were not incidental, they were anticipated and allocated in advance. Supplies, wages, repairs, each element was integrated into a broader structure of cost management. The estate required constant input to maintain its condition, and this input had to be regulated to avoid disruption. This regulation extended to procurement. Materials used within Lyndhurst were selected for their compatibility with existing conditions. Replacements were not introduced without consideration of their effect on the whole. The objective was to prevent visible inconsistency. Even minor deviations could alter perception, and perception was central to the estate's function. Social activity was integrated into this system. Events were not isolated occurrences. They were prepared through routines that ensured consistency across occasions. Tables were arranged according to established patterns. Service followed a sequence that had been refined through repetition. The experience offered to guests depended on this underlying structure. Nothing was left to chance. Even informal interactions were shaped by the environment. The positioning of furniture, the timing of entry and exit, the presence or absence of staff, all contributed to a controlled experience. The estate guided behavior without requiring explicit instruction. This guidance depended on coordination. Information moved through the system continuously. Instructions were relayed, adjustments made, responses anticipated. The estate functioned as a network of small, precise actions, each aligned with a broader objective. Disruption in one area could affect the whole, and so attention was distributed accordingly. What resulted was a form of stability that appeared natural. In practice, it was maintained through discipline. The estate did not sustain itself. It was sustained by a system that operated with consistency, discretion, and control, ensuring that what was visible remained unchanged, regardless of the activity required to achieve it.
Chapter 5. Stability at Scale. At Lyndhurst Mansion, there was a period when operation required no visible adjustment. The systems established within the estate, architectural, social, financial, aligned without friction. What had been designed as a framework began to function as a condition. The coordination of labor, capital, and presence no longer appeared as effort. It resolved into continuity. This was not a moment of expansion, but of balance. The estate did not need to extend itself to assert relevance. Its position had stabilized. Those who entered its grounds did so with an understanding already in place. The patterns of interaction required no reinforcement. They were sustained through repetition alone. Within this environment, timing became exact. Daily routines did not adapt to circumstance. Circumstance adapted to routine. The sequence of preparation, reception, and withdrawal proceeded without interruption. Staff executed their roles with a precision that no longer required correction. Movements aligned, transitions occurred without delay, and the estate maintained a consistent rhythm across days and seasons. This rhythm extended beyond the visible. Financial structures supporting Lyndhurst operated with similar predictability. Expenditures were absorbed without strain. Maintenance, staffing, and provisioning continued at a level that did not require reduction or recalibration. The flow of resources matched the demands of the system without excess or deficiency. In this condition, stability became self-reinforcing. The absence of disruption allowed expectations to harden. Guests arrived anticipating a specific environment and encountered it without deviation. This consistency strengthened the estate's authority. Lyndhurst did not need to demonstrate its capacity. It was assumed. Social interactions within the estate reflected this alignment. Introductions carried established weight. Conversations unfolded within known parameters. Decisions, when reached, did not depend on negotiation alone, but on the context that surrounded them. The estate provided a setting in which outcomes appeared inevitable, shaped as much by environment as by intention. This produced a form of influence that did not require visibility. Agreements formed within Lyndhurst did not need to be announced. Their significance was understood by those involved and transmitted through existing networks. The estate functioned as a point of convergence where alignment could be confirmed without display. Its architecture supported this condition without alteration. Spaces were used as intended without the need for modification. Rooms maintained their roles, circulation followed established paths, and the balance between openness and restriction remained intact. The building did not require adaptation because it was already calibrated to its purpose. The grounds, too, reflected this equilibrium. Landscaping was maintained at a level that required attention but not intervention. Seasonal changes were anticipated and managed within existing routines. The exterior environment reinforced the same sense of order as the interior, controlled, consistent, and without visible strain. What distinguished this period was not intensity, but absence. There were no visible pressures requiring response. The estate did not need to adjust its operations to external conditions. It absorbed variation without altering its structure. This capacity gave the impression of permanence, not as an aspiration, but as a fact. Within this environment, Lyndhurst achieved a particular condition. It operated as both setting and system without distinction between the two. The building, the routines, and the interactions it hosted formed a unified structure. Each element supported the others, and none appeared to operate independently. This unity allowed the estate to function at scale. It accommodated activity without revealing the mechanisms behind it. It sustained relationships without exposing the effort required to maintain them. The complexity of its operations remained concealed even as they continued without interruption. The result was a form of stability that appeared complete, not constructed, not maintained, but simply present.
Chapter 7. Adjustment under pressure. The estate's response to external strain was measured, deliberate, and largely invisible. Lyndhurst Mansion could no longer rely on uninterrupted flows of capital or the predictable participation of its networks. What had been expansive now required selection, and what had been continuous now required calibration. Adjustment did not manifest in grand gestures. It occurred in the management of detail, what was maintained, what was deferred, what was reshaped to meet narrower circumstances. Labor patterns were among the first to reflect this transition. Staff allocations were reconsidered with exacting attention. Tasks were combined where possible, redundancies were minimized, and routines refined to retain the outward appearance of comprehensive care. Those whose roles had once been dedicated to embellishment were reassigned to essential duties. The interior and grounds were preserved, but the labor supporting them was applied with economy, not excess. Every movement, every sequence was reassessed to balance output with available resources. Financial oversight became intensified, not in a visible audit, but in the rhythm of provision. The estate's operating budget was scrutinized more sharply, with expenditures prioritized according to necessity and impact. Luxury could remain, but only where it reinforced the perception of permanence rather than serving as indulgence. Materials were sourced with care. Replacements were selected to match existing conditions precisely, avoiding the expense of conspicuous innovation. The estate absorbed contraction without signaling vulnerability, translating limitation into refinement. Simultaneously, the social environment adjusted. Invitations were issued with heightened selectivity. Events that had once demonstrated breadth were reduced to occasions of focused significance. The presence of visitors now served multiple purposes, maintaining essential networks, confirming alliances, and sustaining the estate's symbolic authority. Absences, once unusual, were anticipated and managed through correspondence and ritual. Each adjustment was designed to preserve coherence, ensuring that the estate continued to operate as a system even as its inputs became constrained. In effect, Lyndhurst entered a controlled state of contraction. Its systems continued to function, but with a narrower margin. The estate did not announce austerity. It presented the same sequence, the same appearance, the same disciplined rhythm. Yet beneath this surface, the mechanisms had been recalibrated. Labor consolidated, expenditure restrained, circulation adjusted, and social engagement focused. The mansion remained intact.
Chapter 8. From System to Artifact. The estate no longer operated as it once had. Lyndhurst Mansion, once a living instrument of coordination and influence, had begun the slow transformation into something different, a managed artifact. Its functions, the constant calibration of labor, finance, and social orchestration, persisted only in a reduced form, retained as ritual rather than necessity. The system that had allowed it to project authority, to mediate networks and sustain wealth, was now largely externalized, codified into practices and expectations maintained for continuity's sake rather than immediate operational utility. The interiors exemplified this shift. Rooms remained arranged according to the sequences established decades before, but their use was increasingly formalized. Chambers that had once hosted negotiation, debate, or demonstration were now maintained in readiness rather than active engagement. Staff continued to follow established routines, but the purpose of those routines had evolved. Cleaning, preparation, and service persisted not to facilitate dynamic activity, but to preserve an impression of order, coherence, and authority without requiring the estate to generate influence in real time. This transformation extended to the grounds.
Gardens were pruned and paths maintained, but with attention less to facilitating movement and more to preserving aesthetic continuity. The landscape became a stage rather than a field for action. The house and grounds now projected memory rather than immediate function. Every hedge clipped, every stone pathway cleared, reinforced the perception of completeness, even as the estate's operational necessity diminished. Financial flows were now primarily oriented toward preservation. Expenditures were directed to maintain appearance rather than sustain an extensive network. Supplies, labor, and repairs were allocated strategically, prioritizing elements most visible to visitors or symbolic within the estate's internal narrative. The economy of operation replaced the expansionary patterns that had once defined the estate. Lyndhurst had entered a mode in which continuity was performed rather than enacted. Social choreography, once integral to reinforcing status and influence, had contracted into selective engagements. Invitations were fewer, targeted, and largely ceremonial. The networks that had been nurtured through repeated interaction became peripheral to the estate itself, where once presence and negotiation within its walls could shape relationships. Now the mansion served as a backdrop, a visible relic of authority whose continued significance depended on memory, habit, and expectation rather than action. The architectural language became a tool of interpretation. Turrets, towers, and asymmetrical facades no longer communicated active negotiation with contemporaries. They asserted endurance, a curated link to a past order. Interiors functioned as visual codification of power. Objects, surfaces, and arrangements performed the estate's legacy. The building had not been abandoned, but it no longer required the labor of influence. Its authority was encoded in preservation. Even staffing had adjusted to this new condition. Roles formerly oriented toward facilitation of interaction or management of complex coordination were redefined. Positions focused on maintenance and caretaking became primary, while those associated with service to active social networks were diminished. Employees now acted less as participants in a living system and more as stewards, translating a set of inherited protocols into visible continuity. Their labor ensured that the estate could endure symbolically, even as its functional centrality waned. This transformation was neither abrupt nor declared. The transition from system to artifact unfolded gradually as internal adjustments and external conditions reinforced each other. The estate's original capacity for stability under pressure had delayed recognition of systemic change, but over time, the absence of dynamic engagement became apparent. Lyndhurst's authority persisted, but it was now mediated through stewardship and observation, not coordination or negotiation. In effect, the estate had shifted from active participation in a living network to a carefully curated display. The rhythms of labor, finance, and social movement that had once produced influence were maintained as an archive of practice. The mansion remained coherent, complete, and commanding, but its power had moved from operational to symbolic. The system that had once functioned through interaction now functioned through presentation.
Chapter 9. What Endurance Conceals. Lyndhurst Mansion stands intact, its walls and towers unchanged in form, its grounds maintained in deliberate order. To the casual observer, it remains as it always was, a coherent expression of wealth, culture, and authority. But endurance, in this instance, is not synonymous with constancy. Survival has been achieved through concealment, through a set of adjustments and interventions that preserve the appearance of functionality, while the underlying system has fundamentally thinned. The estate's visible continuity masks a contraction of purpose.
Where once every room, hallway, and service corridor carried an operational rationale, supporting negotiation, social signaling, and the orchestration of influence, these same spaces now exist primarily to preserve memory. Daily routines persist, but their justification is symbolic rather than instrumental. Staff enact sequences of preparation and maintenance not to facilitate active engagement with elite networks, but to sustain an impression, the illusion that the estate continues to operate as it once did. This concealment extends beyond the immediate walls. The grounds, carefully pruned and arranged, present a stage of permanence, yet the labor sustaining them has been concentrated and selective. The circulation of attention, financial, social, logistical, that had once flowed dynamically through Lyndhurst now moves in measured, constrained patterns. The estate absorbs these reductions without visible fracture, yet the density of activity that originally gave it authority has diminished. Endurance also shapes perception of the past. Visitors, whether scholars, neighbors, or casual observers, are invited to read the mansion as a functioning system, even though its operational core has receded. The architecture, the rooms, the formalized rituals of reception all signal continuity, a stability that once depended on systemic coordination but now rests on management and display. The estate functions as a reference point, a model of what authority looked like rather than an active agent of influence. The implications of this are subtle but pervasive. The mansion's survival obscures the fragility of the conditions that supported it. Networks of connection that once depended on reciprocal engagement, oversight, and presence no longer rely on Lyndhurst for cohesion. Wealth, influence, and social validation have moved into different arenas, leaving the estate as a repository, a curated archive of past capability. The continuity it presents is selective, emphasizing elements that reinforce perception while concealing erosion. This selective preservation shapes the relationship between the estate and memory. Objects, surfaces, and patterns are maintained not for their immediate utility, but for their capacity to communicate authority. The estate's labor force acts as a conduit, translating inherited expectations into visible continuity. What is absent, active negotiation, dynamic influence, operational centrality, is less perceptible precisely because the visible elements remain coherent. Endurance, in this context, is a form of management, of attention, of expectation, and of interpretation. There is a tension embedded in this survival. Lyndhurst continues to occupy its place in the landscape, and it continues to command attention, but the system that once justified that attention has been diluted. Its endurance raises questions about the relationship between form and function. To what extent does the presence of an institution signify strength, and to what extent does it signify the successful masking of irreversible change? The mansion asserts permanence as in its systemic capacity has thinned, suggesting a continuity that is at once real and constructed. The estate's history, which once unfolded as a demonstration of coordination, influence, and operational mastery, is now experienced primarily through preservation. Maintenance routines, curated spaces, and the controlled movement of visitors communicate authority, but they communicate it in a different register, one that is more interpretive than functional. The mansion has become a lens through which past power is viewed.